I can see didn't you say hello to each other? How are you doing? How are you doing?
Very dapper.
Oh,
No, I love that.
it's not Thursday, though.
No, it's not there. I like it. Got to build a critic and bring it out.
For Kelly.
Hey.
What are you doing?
I just came down the street.
I saw that.
Yeah.
Right, they're walking them around.
Yeah, but I didn't September. And I was invited to a workshop in Oxford. So I fly
September.
Yeah, a lot of other things. September to mid-October. Oh, yeah. Distracting. So I was birthday and then the small meeting for some. I think I had. Bill's the senior vice president.
He took Dan's job.
I know. Look at us. Paris, I lived on that Paris High Street, you know, nothing but the best. Yeah. All right, good. Oh, perfect.
Sorry, I want you to
Love that.
Golly, I should have worn my seersucker.
I know.
Seriously.
I go into the shoes as well. Usually you wait till Thursday, right? Yeah. It's hot.
It's over
100. I went back and took a look at some of the videos with the charts and I thought of them differently. You know, today, you know, it's
Somebody asked me something.
It's terrible.
a great story. It makes sense that the charts came from you, but you're keeping that under your hat all these years?
Very weird.
Yeah, the Bush administration was not happy helping with charts.
No. I can't remember.
Yes, yes. Sort of like
All right. Big day.
doing business.
That's right. I've got a similar guy.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Here? Here. All right. A lot.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad everyone's braving a warm summer day to come out here this morning. We have a really good lineup for you this morning, and we're going to be talking about oversight and what that means. This morning, we're debuting our new report by the Bipartisan Policy Center, Oversight Matters, Balancing Mission, Risk, and Compliance. This report was authored by an elite, and an elite group, former public administrators, senior Hill staff, and they've been working hard since last September in recommending a new framework for internal executive branch oversight. And what do we mean by internal executive branch oversight? It means catching problems before they become big mistakes, requiring IG, GAO, or congressional or outside oversight. The new framework recognizes the important role of compliance, but also supplements traditional compliance aspects with an emphasis on mission and performance. Today, I'm proud to welcome our keynote speaker, Congressman Jerry Connolly from the 11th District of Virginia. Importantly, Mr. Connolly chairs the Government Oversight Subcommittee within the Government Reform and Oversight Committee on the Hill. Tremendously important position, oversees everything, every aspect of the federal government, including the District of Columbia, the Post Office, performance management. If it's the man on performance and the man on government oversight, we have you, sir, this morning, and we're most welcome for that. Also want to recognize his staff director on the subcommittee, Wendy Ginsburg, and his scheduler, Lauren Covington, for their assistance in helping us plan today's events. First, I'd like to recognize the task force members. We're going to have two panels of the task force members coming up following Congressman Connolly's remarks, and they're going to be looking at the report and how we came to our recommendations. The second panel will look at the next steps. We also have two outside panel guests this morning with us, Peter Warren with OMB and Ann Eberts, the CEO of the Association of Government Accountants. Could I just get our task force members and our two outside panelists to stand up and we can give them a round of applause early. In summary, we have a good agenda. We're going to start off with Congressman Connolly, as we earlier said, and that's going to be followed by the two panels. Congressman Connolly is going to take short questions and answers from the audience, but will be needing to leave shortly after his presentation. Followed by with the two panels, we're going to have two moderators as well. I want to recognize Becky Zessman. She was our GSA detailee, and she's going to moderate our first panel, and Michael Thorning, the BPC Associate Director for the Congress Project, is going to be moderating our second panel. We'll have audience Q&A with both panels, and then I'll end up doing the final closing remarks. Also, just want to take a quick moment and recognize Brenna McAfee, BPC Project Associate, for her hard work in putting this together. And I also want to give a shout out to John Fortier and John Richter in the audience today, and Don Wolfensberger for their assistance on this report. So thank you, everyone. And Chairman Connolly, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good morning. And thank you to the Bipartisan Center for this initiative. By the way, I want to hear about this Congress project, too. Could use some more help. My remarks today are I want to just frame them, are based on three sets of experience. 20 years as a senior corporate official in corporate life, 14 years in local government, including being chairman and helping to run one of the largest counties in the United States, Fairfax, and now as a member of the legislative branch in Congress. And so I bring that perspective to your work, and I'm going to react to the report. As you know, I do serve as chairman of the Government Operations Subcommittee, which is the largest subcommittee on oversight and reform, the committee constitutionally charged in the House with oversight formally. And I want to begin with a quote from not president, but professor and president of Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson, who said, "Quite as important as legislation is vigilant oversight of administration." He noted, "It's the proper duty of a representative body to look diligently into every affair of government and to talk much about what it sees. It is meant to be the eyes and the voice and to embody the wisdom and will of its constituents." In fact, Woodrow Wilson argued that the informing function of Congress, from his point of view, should be preferred even to its legislative function. Something we ought to keep in mind when we look at the issuance of subpoenas. And so it was with great interest I looked at the Oversight Matters Balancing Mission Risk and Compliance report. It's an important topic to examine, and in particular, it's an important time for oversight because we are, frankly, in a constitutional clash right now over this very subject. What is the legitimate role of Congress, the separate but co-equal branch of government, in Article 1 of our Constitution? And the idea that somebody in the executive could circumscribe the role of Congress in saying, I don't believe that inquiry has a legitimate legislative basis, is itself an assertion of a threat and a challenge to the legitimate oversight role of Congress. The report does a wonderful job of defining executive branch oversight as an examination of federal departments and agencies with a threefold purpose: ensure agencies are effectively accomplishing their missions, improve efficiency and effectiveness, and combat waste, fraud, and abuse. But I'd add two more. If done well, good oversight informs the public and nourishes democracy. It has an educational impact that I think is necessary for an informed electorate. And secondly, it serves as a catalyst as well as a prelude for future congressional action. Oversight, as both Wilson and the courts have said, is at least as important as Congress's legislative function. I agree with many of the report's findings, but I do have some concerns about an outsized focus maybe on efficiency. Efficiency is just one goal of the federal government, and sometimes, believe it or not, is outweighed by other interests. It is these tensions among the values of democratic government that enliven our Republican and gender great debate. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. First, I agree that with the conclusion that the Federal Information Technology Acquisition Reform Act is a piece of legislation that reduces government waste and is key framework for how we proceed on IT management and procurement. I might be a little bit biased. I helped co-write the bill. FTAR challenges agencies to incorporate proven best practices into their IT postures and allows for robust oversight by giving Congress, GAO, and the public metrics on a scorecard that facilitates comparison of agencies across the government. This is maybe one of the first models in recent time where we've taken a legislative, a statutory framework and translated it into actual metrics we can monitor and evaluate twice a year and call agencies to account for what progress they are or are not achieving. And I think it's not a bad model. And we, as I said, do 2 hearings a year looking at that scorecard that we've worked out with GAO. I'm very proud to be continuing to champion that law and its implementation. We're talking about $100 billion a year at least federal IT procurement budget. So it's not trivial, and IT imbues everything we do and how we do it, and even affects, the mission. We needed no greater example of what can go wrong when you don't pay attention to your IT management. Remember the rollout of Obamacare. When that website crashed, everybody was shocked, and there were all these stories that, the Affordable Care Act was going to collapse with it. And it was a painful object lesson of the connection between something that was seen maybe as a technical management issue and the actual mission, the actual objective of a major policy and programmatic goal. Second, we're also in agreement that the federal government needs to better understand, accept, and work to mitigate risk. You have a recommendation that OMB should consider, for example, building on existing risk frameworks by incorporating mission performance as the end goal. No company in the private sector operates without the assumption that a few eggs will get broken, and neither should government. But the public sector is not the private sector. There are all kinds of demands and constraints unique to the public sector we don't experience in the private sector. In government, for example, expectations and demands are exponentially higher. As you noted in the report, government has to build and maintain the public trust. There are certain actions government must take to inspire, maintain, and be appropriate stewards of that trust. And accountability is essential in ways absolutely inexperienced in the private sector. Take, for example, the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program known as FedRAMP. We're having a hearing on this topic tomorrow. We're working with government and industry to codify FedRAMP, which is a process that allows IT cloud service providers to get authorization to contract with the federal government to help collect and retain important and sometimes incredibly sensitive information in the cloud environment. The bill we're working on is basically about understanding, accepting, and working to mitigate risk. The goal is to allow agencies to securely contract with private sector companies to move information at all levels of sensitivity to the cloud. The bill would make certain that both agencies and the private sector companies they contract with are aware of and work to mitigate security weaknesses in the system. Not all information needs the same security protections, so FedRAMP allows agencies to define their own cloud security needs. We simply seek to codify the process by which agencies assess, mitigate, and accept those risks, and to try to make government a lot more efficient in the approval and certification process. FedRAMP, I think, could be a model for how the executive branch, the private sector, and Congress collaborate to find ways to proactively incorporate risk management into federal activities. Additionally, if overseers are aware of risks that agencies are taking prior to any incident, and if overseers were satisfied that mitigation of these risks was taken seriously, we can avoid the type of gotcha oversight that often stymies innovation and breakthroughs. And here, Congress is part of the problem. You know, we just can't resist the temptation to highlight something gone wrong. Politically, the payoff is just great. But every time you do that, you're taking a bite out of the willingness of federal employees and managers to take risks. Steve Jobs said he learned very little from his successes. He learned everything from his failures. Failures are a necessary part of risk-taking, and we've got to work on our threshold of acceptability for failure. Third, I agree that we also need data-driven solutions to the complex problems we're trying to solve as a nation. Using data and information to define and address problems is critical to mission execution and oversight. Federal agencies have seen incredible success in using data to tackle issues and to improve the mission. Data allows us also to set metrics, which we absolutely have to know whether we're meeting our mission goals. Last Wednesday, the Office of Management and Budget released its much-anticipated guidance related to implementation of the Foundation for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018. This law prompts agencies to engage with their stakeholders to ensure that they're working to solve the right problems and serving the communities they're authorized to serve. It also encourages agencies to incorporate these stakeholders' ideas while also strengthening privacy protections by codifying clear penalties for misuse or abuse of government data and information. And by the way, that's not without controversy. You may have noticed our committee, for example, has already had 2 hearings on facial recognition technology and how that is used or potentially abused. And that's, I predict, going to be a topic of great interest. And by the way, brings together an interesting coalition of members of Congress, because there are deep concerns about it from the right, and there are deep concerns about it from the left. And so you're going to see a convergence on a bipartisan basis, I think, in looking at potential legislative guidelines, if not some limitations. Most importantly, the Evidence Act encourages worthy goals while strengthening those private protections. We can be certain we will continue oversight and implementation of this act. But many agencies are already taking advantage of new technologies and data access to save lives. For example, the Mine Safety Health Administration is using existing data sets to help predict where and when deadly mine incidents are most likely to occur, and is then working with private sector mine owners to determine root causes of the weaknesses to prevent them. The FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, used existing data from several different agencies to determine which homes and businesses needed flood mitigation inspection and which did not, in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. The use of that data got families back in their home and businesses in the areas up and running again in less than a quarter of the time it would otherwise have taken, and the effort saved the government about $20 million. These are great examples of how we can use data in incorporating risk management, build trust with stakeholders, and allow robust oversight. We know this can be done. We know that oversight and prudent risk-taking can work in tandem to even save lives. Now, a little bit of pushback on some of the findings. In particular, the recommendation that internal oversight bodies reduce the time they spend on compliance-related activities. I push back on that because there is value in compliance. If we put this in perspective, the report creates a kind of zero-sum balance, I think, between compliance and performance. I argue that they go hand in hand in a democratic society. Performance seeks to achieve policy results that matter to real people. Compliance ensures that those results are achieved in ways that comport with our democratic values and with the goals we've set legislatively as a society. Compliance provides democratic accountability, discipline, fairness, ensures the rule of law, promotes integrity, and fosters effective stewardship of the public trust. Compliance ensures that the decision-making chain that leads to government performance outcomes are more diverse and inclusive than in the private sector. Let's take, for example, the Freedom of Information Act, which provides the public presumptive access to federal records. That law is cumbersome. It's costly. It slows government performance. From any perspective, FOIA is a compliance exercise. And yet, as a democratic society, we've decided its costs are worth the benefits in fostering greater trust and access by the public and contributing to a more transparent federal government. FOIA, in fact, makes the performance of federal agencies more meaningful, stronger, and more accepted. It allows the dissent and conversation, getting more voices into the process. It vests government action with trust and legitimacy. Performance would fail were it not for compliance. Oversight is needed for a democratic government to maintain legitimacy. It's critically different from the private sector in that regard. And you can see these compliant exercises in a variety of laws and regulations: the Federal Register Act, Privacy Act, the Inspector General Act, the Data Quality Act, the Paperwork Reduction Act, the Federal Information Technology Acquisition Reform Act, and most recently, the Foundation for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. Every one of these compliance requirements was built from experience and lessons learned. They aren't all perfect, nothing is, but they bake democratic values into government performance and operations. And they shouldn't be thought of as a nuisance. They should be thought of as foundational. They're tools whereby we can implement programs and meet our goals. In cases where context and circumstance change, agencies can work with members of Congress, like myself, to change compliance requirements to make them more effective and to help agencies better improve their missions. Congress welcomes conversations and deliberations like that. That's our job. And we're ready to make these tough decisions. And we stand prepared to ensure that agencies execute their missions in ways that serve the people and foster trust in our democracy. Democracy's hard. It's messy, it's clumsy. It can be very frustrating. It is, by definition, inefficient, and it was intended as such. Having a voice in how and when government serves you, and to constantly question whether government's doing it right, is a cornerstone of what it means in a democracy to be an American. I hearken back to President Woodrow Wilson, president of Princeton. The argument is not, he said, that discussed and interrogated administration is only pure and efficient administration. But more than that, that the only really self-governing people is that people which discusses and interrogates its administration. I think that's an important principle. Thank you for having me here today. Thank you for your report. Shoot away.
Congressman Don Wolfensberger with the Bipartisan Policy Center. Good to see you and enjoyed your remarks.
Thank you.
Today, the House is scheduled to vote on a contempt citation for Attorney General Barr and Commerce Secretary Ross. I assume these relate to the census controversy. A, is this going to be civil or criminal contempt? Because criminal can only be brought by, I guess, the Justice Department, whereas civil, the House could unilaterally go to the courts. And B, where do you see this going, given the fact that Trump has withdrawn the citizenship question?
Well, when it comes to enforcing congressional subpoenas, I am a strict constructionist. I believe the legislative branch is indeed and was intended to be a separate but co-equal branch of government. The executive branch can enforce its subpoenas, and you can go to jail if you define. The judicial branch can send you, right away, contempt of court and put you in jail. Ignoring a grand jury subpoena can put you in jail. Why in the world would we say or accept that an entire branch of government, the legislative branch, its subpoenas are somehow subpar? They're not as enforceable. And when a subpoena is issued, you will and you must comply. And if you don't, we're going to prosecute you. We're going to pursue that through the courts. And if necessary, we will, and I hope we will, revive inherent contempt. Inherent contempt was the process Congress used for the first 150 years of the Republic until roughly the 1930s, whereby we can direct the sergeant at arms to arrest you, bring you back if you're not here in town. We can impose fines. We can make recommendations these days to the bar to disbar you. We can, if you're a federal official, stop paying you, and we can also incarcerate you, put you in jail. I believe that in light of the unprecedented defiance of subpoenas across the board by this administration, we must do that. And you have to understand that you will risk your own autonomy as well as your livelihood if you persist in cooperating with the presidential directive to defy subpoenas. Now, both Attorney General Barr and Wilbur Ross have done just that. They have failed to produce documents we want, and they have failed to answer for themselves in terms of the process. It is true that President Trump has lost the battle. They didn't give it up because they recognized Congress had a point. They gave it up because there was a Supreme Court ruling that was very difficult to defy, even though, by the way, they contemplated it. That doesn't mean that our inquiry does not still have merit. And I think the public, here we go back to this whole issue of oversight and accountability and compliance. I believe that this compliance process will help illuminate for the public what transpired and why. And that the idea, the assertion that adding a question was actually trying to help us implement the Voting Rights Act was a complete fabrication. It was a lie. In fact, the opposite is true. And I believe we're going to be able to prove that. There's already data, documentary evidence, that would clearly show that the motivation was much more sordid and base. It was to suppress minority representation in communities across America, and by discouraging their participation and cooperation with the census. So, yeah, I'm enthusiastically going to vote for that contempt citation. Yeah. Elaine.
This is an excellent Congress, I just have to say. Although you're not my district, but you're the next district over. My name's Elaine Middleton.
I like to say everyone's congressman in Northern Virginia, you know.
Well, then we'll claim you. You used to be in Fairfax County.
That's right.
So, yeah, absolutely. Anyway, this is a different topic, and I'll try to be very quick, but another project I've worked on for years involves the Skyland Shopping Center project in southeast Washington, D.C. It was taken by eminent domain. Anyway, the D.C. government has used HUD, millions of dollars HUD Community Development Block Grant funds, and now also the EB-5 funds where Chinese people get visas. And in both cases, there literally has been no oversight. This is the word oversight. Millions of dollars supposedly God knows what the benefit is. The HUD regulations require, quote, benefit low and moderate income persons. In this case, after the DC government spent millions to acquire the property, they sold 18 acres to the developer for $700,000, if you can believe that. And the EB5 job estimate was, that I got through FOIA, was like 2,000 jobs created, when in fact I don't think any jobs have been created. So both of those projects, I think, are sorely lacking in oversight. And I've sent repeated emails to HUD and to the EB5 people, and I mean, they don't even answer you. So, thank you.
Well, I mean, we didn't talk about the role of the press, but as somebody who came from local government, one of the things I really bemoan is one of the key pieces of accountability and oversight is a free press, right? That's rigorous and active. And if you look at communities all over America, our local newspapers have collapsed. They just don't exist. I mean, I think we have two in Fairfax, for example, each of which maybe have 2 active reporters, maybe 1. I often see an issue of a paper with just 1 journalist, and her name is on every story. And that means that, and the Washington Post has retreated too in local government here. Now here we are in the shadow of the nation's capital. There's virtually no scrutiny of local government anymore. In Arlington and Fairfax still there is, in Northern Virginia and Montgomery County and Prince George's and DC, but there's been a wholesale retreat by local press that used to be very vigorous. And that really is a threat, it seems to me, for oversight and accountability, because they're the ones that had investigative reporters. They're the ones that would follow up on something like that. And that's almost disappeared across America. And what could go wrong with that? And I say that as someone who comes from local government. We had a clean form of government, but having a free, vigorous media that was willing to ask, big questions and follow up on them was really critical. And that's, by the way, why FOIA becomes even more important. If we're going to create a vacuum by the disappearance of a vigorous, inquiring press, then the ability of citizens or groups of citizens to use FOIA to access the information and follow up on it becomes even more important.
So I've done several FOIAs to HUD, and I'm in a fight with them now about the FOIA because they said that I had to pay fees because this was in my commercial interest, which is totally not correct. And I've had OJAs is trying to negotiate with HUD, and then they said it was based on my past history, so they personalize it against me, HUD, that you're this bad person that keeps asking us questions, so we're going to charge you more money. It's just outrageous.
Well, when I was in local government in Virginia, believe it or not, has one of the most robust sunshine laws in America. And I can tell you, everything I did was subject to FOIA, and you had a very limited space of time in which to comply with a FOIA request. And you'd better comply or you put yourself at real risk. Legally and financially. And we took it very seriously. We had to. Naturally, of course, the state legislature exempted itself from those robust FOIA laws. But that's a different story. Somebody else? Yeah.
Good morning, Congressman. Thank you.
Good morning.
Just a quick question. As we are nearing the end of this fiscal year and we're reaching the debt ceiling, and now where there's a threat of potentially another government shutdown, after the last government shutdown, I think there was some discussion around trying to implement some legislation that would actually sort of allow government to continue to function, maybe at the current appropriation level or something to avoid, the impact of the shutdown. Any sense on sort of whether any of those proposals have had traction, or your views on kind of where things are at the moment?
There are during that shutdown, there were lots of well-intentioned proposals to protect various clusters of federal employees, federal contractors from the worst effects of the shutdown. And there was discussion, as you suggest, about, well, maybe we have an automatic mechanism that in the event of Congress failing to get its regular appropriation bill or CR done, there's kind of a flatline CR that kicks in so that nobody's harmed for whatever period of time. Well, in an ideal world, we would do that. But, of course, in an ideal world, we would never shut down the government. The problem is, given the striation of our politics these days, right, there's a group in the right who would love that. And they'll never pass an appropriation bill because we'll always have a lower level of funding, and that's a good thing from their point of view. And so we'll never get to, in trying to solve one problem, we create another. And so we're very worried about unintended consequences and doing that as a good government measure, even though it makes sense as a fail-safe. But the downside of it is we'll never get to an honest discussion about what makes sense, and let's fight it out about an appropriate level of funding for X, Y, and Z. Yeah. You really could be a Southern congressman.
And you're the one.
He needs a straw hat, somebody.
And you're the one from Virginia.
And I'm the one from Virginia.
What's on the subcommittee's oversight agenda for the next year? And what are some highlights that we can expect?
Yeah, glad you asked. So, when we took over the majority this year, the press was constantly, the press had a narrative that all we were about was getting Trump, going after Trump. My first hearing on the Government Operations Subcommittee was on the Merit System Protection Board. I mean, come on. How sexy can you get? Then we had another one on the Federal Labor Relations Act, and we had our FedRAMP hearing, and we had a field hearing on the effect of the shutdown on contractors and contract employees who were not protected, which is another subject we want to try to address. We didn't have any hearings on Trump or his travail in the White House. All of our work has been done on sort of the good government level. Important, if not sexy, and of course we're OPM is going to be a major part of what we do. I mentioned FedRAMP. We're going to have a hearing at FedRAMP tomorrow, and then we're going to mark up a FedRAMP bill to get it into the statute. And we've been working a lot both with GSA and the private sector to try to make sure we get that right. But I feel very strongly that it needs a statutory anchor. It doesn't have one right now. And it's a very important tool as we move toward the cloud and try to make government more efficient and more accountable and 21st century. OPM is a great example. If you look at your report and you kind of create a matrix, OPM is a great case study. It's a great case study of why we need compliance, why we need performance, why we need accountability, why we need oversight. So the administration proposed, no, it didn't even propose. It decided that it wants to abolish OPM, an entire federal agency. Now, this is an agency that, yeah, it's got its problems in technology, but lots of, hey, I have a scorecard. Lots of federal agencies have a problem with technology. If the rationale is let's abolish any agency with a problem in technology, we're going to abolish about a dozen. It's a subterfuge for being able to say, feather in our cap, we abolish the federal agency, and we abolish the one that is charged with protecting and managing the affairs of federal employees. So OPM is not only the agency that on snow days says early leave today or liberal leave today, or if you're in a telework program, please use it, but it's also the agency that coordinates the annual federal employee health benefit program, which reaches 2.5 million federal employees and another 2.5 million retirees. It's a huge program. Its reach goes to well over 8 million people in terms of recipients. It is an archival place for job applications, for security clearances. It provides guidance on a host of issues that matter to federal employees, to our workforce. Promotions, retirement, when you file for retirement, all that is processed by OPM. And the proposal is let's cut it kind of like in two, and the political civil service Hatch Act responsibilities will migrate into OMB. And the HR functions will migrate to GSA because GSA has a pretty good IT capability. Now, that analysis. We have had a protected professional civil service since the 1870s, 1880s. And it's the pride of America, right? It's a model for other countries around the world to keep your professional workforce non-political. I don't get to appoint my relatives to key positions in the federal government. And which, by the way, came as news to my Irish relatives in Boston when I got elected. Why would you run for... No. You know, we protected ourselves from that and in civil service reform. And when you abolish OPM, which is headed by a confirmable director, that director is subject to Senate advice and consent, which automatically brings them into the purview of congressional oversight. When you go to OMB, the OMB director is a presidential appointee, not subject to Senate confirmation. And you think he is?
He is the director.
But works for the president directly. Anyway, we're very worried about that. And we don't think that's a wise thing to do. The argument that you'd put the HR functions into GSA, I mean, if the argument is because they've got a good IT capability, well, so does AID. So why don't we just put it all at AID, since they're even better than GSA in some scoring? And I mean, that just makes no sense. GSA's specialty is buildings and leases, not HR. I will say there has not been a single rationale provided to Congress for why do you want to do this and why does this make sense. Take your report. Give me data. Give us metrics. Show us the savings. Show us why it's more efficient and makes more sense. We're open to the argument. It hasn't been made. And when we ask for the legal authority, show us the legal authority you've got to do this. The document finally provided, reluctantly, was entirely redacted. The entire legal opinion, such as it was blacked out. And on that basis, we're supposed to abolish a federal agency and merge its pieces into other agencies where the rationale for that merger is thin or non-existent. And so now you're up against Congress's oversight role. So what have we done? We went to the Appropriations Committee and we blocked the $50 million transition request from the administration to do this. We got language that said thou may not proceed in the appropriation bill. When the OPM director, acting OPM director, threatened to fire or RIF 150 federal employees in her agency if we didn't act by October 1, I got an amendment on the floor passed with fair amount of Republican support that said you can't do that. You don't have the authority to do that, and that passed the House. And of course, we had our first oversight hearing on this, and I think it's going to be the first of many. And the way they've done it has now triggered a strong congressional reaction that I think will only grow. I would say the hearing we had was maybe one of the most disastrous I've ever seen in terms of an executive branch representatives trying to even articulate what they were doing and why. And that's why oversight's important. I mean, let's hold in advance whether it's a good or bad idea. I'll assert it's bad, but it allows Congress to do its job and to hold the executive branch accountable. And here's a great case where they need to be. They need to be held accountable. And so the whole process of oversight, we're talking about data, rationale, ultimate performance impacts, and compliance. Compliance with the law, compliance with legislative guidance are very important in the process. And it's one you might want to watch because we haven't got an end here, but it's a process that's, I think, critically important to millions of federal employees. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your comments. I was just wondering, a few days ago, President Trump's lawyers argued in a federal appeals court that the Oversight Committee does not have the constitutional authority to oversight the office of the presidency, and I was wondering if you could comment on that a little bit.
Well, in a democracy like ours, in a constitutional system like ours, the framers built in this dialectic, right? This tension among the branches deliberately, so that no one branch had dominant power. And remember the context, right? The last thing in the world they wanted was an unchecked chief executive. They were fresh off George III and his tender loving mercies after a bloody, horrible, 7 or 8 year Revolutionary War that was anything but romantic. And so they wanted checks and balances, and very vigorous checks and balances, and that's why they saw the legislative branch as the preeminent branch. They said that in the Federalist Papers. And that's why Article 1 is not about the president. Article 1 is about the legislative branch, Congress. In fact, Madison thought that by definition, the legislative branch would be self-correcting. That is to say, we would not do things that were on their face unconstitutional, and we would self-regulate legislation as to constitutionality. It was never envisioned in the Constitution that the Supreme Court would actually review legislation and make decisions substantively about their constitutionality. You won't find that in the Constitution. John Marshall made that up. I say all of this because the idea that the executive branch would arrogate to itself the determination as to whether Congress has a legitimate oversight function, and where in Congress that oversight function lies. The Constitution is explicit about Congress's absolute right to organize itself and police itself. And we set our own ethics rules, nobody else. We set what committees of jurisdiction there will be. We set the rules of operation and procedure. No one else can interfere with that constitutionally. And courts have recognized that forever. So the idea that they would go to court and say, our committee, by the way, we've decided, not Congress, that our committee is not the repository of responsibility primarily for oversight. We're not the only ones, but we are explicitly charged with that, is absurd on its face, and no court, in my view, is going to uphold such an assertion. Take one last one, and then I gotta go. Is that all right? All right.
I was wondering if you could...
Is there a mic over here? You're gonna need that mic.
I was wondering if you could talk about the impact of all of these acting/empty positions in the administration.
Can I talk about the impacts of what?
The acting/...
Oh, yeah.
administration and how that, if at all, affects oversight?
Yeah. What a great question. Well, it's unprecedented that we have so many cabinet members and sub-cabinet members who are in an acting capacity, including the staff director for the White House, chief of staff. And Trump has said, I actually prefer it because it's easier to move people around and get rid of them if I want to get rid of them, and I don't have all that headache of confirmation. And it's kind of a novel view of our form of government. I would say he's clearly the first president deliberately to use his power to appoint on an acting basis so many people in government. And now we get, let's think about your report again. Oversight and accountability. It dilutes both when someone's in an acting capacity. It kind of fuzzifies the lines of responsibility to the public and to the Congress when you're in an acting capacity. And it gives more power to the president, who can, kind of play games with your status. You know that at a moment's notice, you can be dismissed without any recourse because you're acting. Now, in theory, he could also dismiss a cabinet member who is confirmed. That's true. But that person has standing, statutory standing, constitutional standing, that an acting player does not. And so I think it weakens government. I think it is not a good management model. It's not one we would use in the private sector. Somebody may be appointed temporarily, but that means there's a search going on for the permanent replacement. And I just don't think it's a good management model. And I think everything we're talking about in your report is damaged, frankly, by the proliferation of acting. Listen, thank you all so much for having me here today. Good luck with your deliberations.
Not at all. Thank you, Congressman. So thank you all for joining us here today. My name is Becky Zussman. I am a consultant here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I'm on detail from the General Services Administration. It is my pleasure to be sitting here with the first of our two panels, who are distinguished people in themselves, and it's my pleasure to introduce them. I'm going to just jump right into it. We're a little bit behind. So I'm going to start here with Robert Shea. Robert is a principal at Grant Thornton in the public sector. He's been working to improve government's performance for the past 25 years, actually, starting.
Nice of you to say.
Yes, you're welcome. Starting with Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives, and the Senate, then moving into the White House at OMB, and now at Grant Thornton. Robert is a fellow and former chairman at the National Academy of Public Administration, otherwise known as NAPA, and he was appointed to the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, which we talked about a little bit with Congressman, and which made important recommendations for better integration of evidence into policymaking. So thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Becky.
Next, we have Clarence Crawford. Clarence is an adjunct associate professor at American University. He's founder and president of Teach 'em to Fish, a community development corporation. He recently completed his term as the first vice chair of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, WMATA.
Yes,
so congratulations on completing that term.
Yes, getting it over with. Getting it over.
I'll see you afterwards.
Yeah.
That's a
But
hard
prior
job.
to all that, Clarence actually had quite an extensive career in the federal government, where he started as a GS1, if you don't mind my saying so.
Please.
And worked his way up to the senior executive service, where he held many senior executive positions, including roles at the General Accounting Office for the Congress, the White House Office of Management and Budget, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and the Office of Personnel Management. So thank you for being here and sharing your expertise with us. Next up, we have Sally Ann Harper. Welcome, Sally Ann.
Thank you, Becky.
Sally Ann is an adjunct professor at Brookings Executive Education. She is past president for the Association of Federal Enterprise Risk Management, and she's held the following C-suite positions in the federal government. She's a former chief financial officer at the Government Accountability Office, GAO. She is a former chief administrative office, also at GAO officer, and she's a former chief financial officer at the EPA. So welcome here today. Next, Janice LaChance. Janice is currently the Executive Vice President of Strategic and Organizational Excellence at the American Geophysical Union. She is a former president of the American Society for Public Administration and former director of the Office of Personnel Management. She is also a fellow and board member at the National Academy of Public Administration. We have a couple of NAPA fellows with us here today. Last but not least, Peter Warren. Peter, thank you for joining us. Peter is the Associate Director of the Office of Management and Budget, the Executive Office of the Vice President. He is a former Director of Oversight in the Senate Committee on the Budget, and he is a former Policy Director in the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. So we look forward to your perspectives. So I want to start by talking about executive oversight in general. We have the pleasure of having 4 of the task members who actually worked on writing the report here with us today. and one task force member who actually worked on the report before this on oversight, which looked at inspectors general.
We're supposed to pretend you didn't really write the report, Becky?
Yes. Thank you. Well, so you've worked now on 2 reports on oversight, and so I was curious as to why it's such an important topic to you and why it should be important to our audience.
Congressman Connolly talked a lot about the role of Congress. Congress charges in law the executive branch with faithfully implementing those laws. It charges a number of agencies, OMB, GSA, OPM, with overseeing various important management functions of agencies. And so in order for things to, you can't enact those laws and expect agencies to alone go and execute these without some help. And so, agencies perform a lot of functions that require oversight from the EPA or the Department of Labor, even though the central management functions are left to OPM, OMB, and GSA. There are plenty of other entities throughout the federal government that execute executive branch oversight functions. Waste, fraud, and abuse is clearly an important function to eliminate, making sure that we restore trust in government by eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse. The most important thing they can do is ensure agencies are focusing on mission, accomplishing the important outcomes agencies are charged with. One of the things that I think Congressman Connolly misses is the extent to which we drive organizations to focus too much on compliance and not enough on outcomes. He talked about FTARA. I don't think anyone would suggest that all of our IT investments are humming like a Swiss watch today as a result of that law. FSMA is another example. Plenty of reporting about compliance with information security requirements, but I'm not sure we have a stronger information security foundation today than when that law was enacted. Improper payments is another great example. No question the government makes billions of dollars in improper payments, but the extensive investment we've made in requiring agencies to report what they're doing to prevent improper payments has driven the cost of compliance up, when I'm not sure we've seen a correlating reduction in improper payments. So there's a balance that I think can't be it can't be overstated that we're out of balance today.
Sure.
And we need to get back into balance.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, Peter, you have the distinction of being the only person on the panel who has not been talking about this for months. So I was wondering, I did notice that several of your past job titles had the word oversight in them. So I was wondering why oversight is important to you and what brought you to this group today.
We actually do talk about it quite a bit, but not maybe
Not
the
in this
specific
group.
report or the panel.
Not academically.
Yes. Yes, my background, I do have considerable background in oversight. I worked for Darrell Issa when he was chairman of the Oversight Committee, and I was sort of the legislative director, but I also supervised the oversight in all the areas of the committee's alleged jurisdiction. And my first job on the Hill was actually with the oversight subcommittee on the education committee. And so before I came to the administration a couple of years ago, that congressional perspective was my perspective when it came to oversight. And I did agree with Chairman Connolly on one thing, which is that incentives matter, and he acknowledged that Congress, in doing oversight, they are aware of the effect on the press and public perception of the oversight they do, and indeed that largely shapes, it's not hard to see, a lot of the oversight that Congress does, which I think he acknowledged. And so again, these incentives matter, and they matter to Congress, and indeed, they're going to matter to the executive branch. Because the executive branch, to the extent that, then there's a lot of resources that go into performance reviews and internal executive branch management, from agencies and from OMB. I mean, of course there's going to be some responsiveness to, well, what is being watched? What are we going to be criticized for? What is the media watching? What is Congress watching? What is Congress going to come back to us for? So it certainly does, in that sense, it's going to have an impact on what the focus is. And so if the focus is, from Congress is on waste, fraud, and abuse, or violating statutes, regardless of exactly what the effect of that statutory violation is on, for instance, program performance, then there's going to be a tendency to direct oversight efforts in that area. And that's what sort of the ERM model, you might say, sort of like pushes back against that to try and balance interests.
Great, thank you. Clarence, Salian, or Janice, anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think that exactly is the balance that we're trying to achieve, especially with ERM, a risk-based perspective to that.
Great.
Absolutely.
And I think as the public looks to government repeatedly to first when there's a problem and that gets exposed in the media, or when they need a service, when there's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, people look to their government. They want it to work well. They have expectations. And I think that balance between oversight and actually creating programs with the freedom and the ability to meet the needs of our citizens is critical. And if we have to sacrifice a little bit of oversight maybe, or give people a little bit more leeway so that we can be the most effective, the most efficient, the most to meet what we have to do to meet the needs of our citizens, I think that's critically important.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
It's interesting, Congressman Connolly talked about the need for greater risk tolerance.
Yes.
But also emphasized how important compliance was.
Yeah.
I'm not sure those are consistent points of view.
Well, and so he talked about it as a zero-sum game as well. I don't think that's the way you all talked about it in the report. Anyone want to comment on that?
I think what we were looking for in the task force was a balance of the competing interests of having adequate compliance checks, but also shifting a focus toward a more risk-based perspective in terms of helping to achieve better program outcomes. And I think one of the theses that we were working with was that an over-reliance on compliance, checklist compliance, particularly, may not achieve the goals that you were trying to achieve anyway, and yet it consumes a tremendous amount of bandwidth that perhaps might be better used to focus more on the programmatic outcomes. We also looked at whether the oversight community might use a risk-based perspective in selecting the highest priority engagements for them to take on. Again, that would ultimately assist in mission accomplishment and program outcome.
And I think also when you look at from a compliance standpoint, I believe that we're out of balance there. When you start to look at these things in slices, you reinforce silos, you reinforce them around technology or whatever, and really in terms of if you really want to make government more effective and you really want to be more efficient, and also with the accountability, you look at ERM, it's now more horizontal. It's bringing more people together. It's getting the employees to begin to own part of the solution. That's where I think we need to go. And I think what's happened is with the siloed approach is we now have chief officer for everything. We've got about 10 or 12 different chief officers that report to an agency head, as well as the mission side and general counsel. And it's, when you step back and you think about it, we're now asking agency heads to supervise 10, 15, 20 different people. It's not going to happen. Whereas I think if you look at a more balanced performance accountability framework, I think you'd move more towards chief management officers that would be responsible for managing portions of the organization, as opposed to creating all of these silos that are almost impossible to manage, and you lose a lot of efficiency, and I think you lose a lot of credibility within the government, but also with the public.
So you talked about a few topics there that I want to circle back to. One was ERM and one was the silos. So let's start with ERM. Sally Ann, you're a bit of an ERM expert, and that enterprise risk management is what ERM stands for those of you who don't know. But would you mind giving a layman's overview of what it is and why the task force used that as the framework for this report?
I would take the bit of expert with a large grain of salt.
I would take the bit out. Just
However, enterprise risk management, I really like the Association of Federal Enterprise Risk Management's definition of that. And what it says is that it is a discipline that addresses the full spectrum of an agency or an organization's risks, challenges, but also opportunities that are presented, and that it is integrating them into an enterprise-wide portfolio view that is strategically aligned with what the agency, the department, is trying to achieve. To be fair, agencies all over the federal, state, and local spectrum do risk management. They have always done risk management. But as Clarence alluded to, it has tended to be siloed. It has tended to be either functional or programmatic. It has not got a common lexicon. It doesn't have a common agreement about what risk looks like or how to deal with it, if you deal with it. So enterprise risk management is an approach that then connects the dots to that across an entire entity, trying to bring it together. And the report actually takes it a step further than OMB did when they did a 123 and incorporated enterprise risk management as part of that under my esteemed colleague Dave Mader when he was at OMB. It takes it to the point where enterprise risk management is an absolutely critical component of the feedback loops for resource allocation as well as for performance, with an end goal that takes it to how are we contributing to the accomplishment of the mission of the organization.
Thank you. So from that OMB perspective, Peter, anything you'd like to add?
I'm glad you said that. That's exactly what we're doing right now. Currently, we're going through these agency strategic reviews that we do under the sort of GEPREMA umbrella. And what many of the agencies are now doing is they're really looking at risk. And so in their strategic goals, what they're doing is, many of them are looking at each of the strategic goals, and in each of them, like basically having a risk, an overlay of what are looking at the risks on each of those goals, like how high are the risks, what are the risks, what are the, not just how are we doing in performing these goals, but essentially what are the consequences. And that, I think that creates the sort of prioritization that we're talking about here, and it's going to be different for every agency. Some agencies are more personnel intensive, so hiring issues may have greater consequence, greater risk for them than other agencies. Some are more IT focused in terms of the sorts of systems they have and the consequences of failure of those systems. So the consequence of failure, the risk of failure, is extremely high, but it's going to vary amongst agencies, and so a lot of the agencies are doing essentially like hierarchies of risk.
I think, Becky, to final point, there are implications for the accountability community in that taking a more risk-based perspective when deciding how to align their resources. The GAO has 95% of its work already dictated by the Congress or by statutory mandate, and yet every 2 years it will publish its high-risk list of the highest risks in government where attention needs to be paid. I think inspectors general, more or less, could adopt a similar framework to looking at how they would prioritize what would both be a benefit to the ultimate achievement of the mission of an organization and what would be most at risk from their accountability perspective.
Sure.
The one thing I would add in the risk conversation is the cultural challenges associated with implementing an ERM program. I mean, the easiest part of the ERM program is developing the policies and procedures. The hardest thing is then to actually bring this ERM program to life, because it is a tremendously different way. When we grew up in government, we grew up in silos, and the rules were, if I had a problem, I didn't tell anyone, because if I told someone, it would be an indication perhaps I'm not competent to manage the problem, so I kept it to myself. With ERM, to get it to actually function properly, you have to create a culture in which people are empowered to raise concerns, to be able to talk across an organization so that you have a clear understanding of what the real risks are in terms of achieving mission. We look at it from an agency-wide perspective, but it can also be at an installation level. I'll just tell you very quickly. A friend of mine had a knee replacement surgery about 3 years ago at a VA hospital. And you know, there have been a lot of questions about VA hospitals. What was interesting was the surgeons were not coming up. They couldn't get the surgeons to come to the floor. So the nurse says, I'm going to call whatever this thing is. All of these doctors came. And I watched. The most fascinating thing was her supervisors came to her and said, good job. Many of the doctors, as they left, said, good job. That is an example of the kind of culture you have to have in an ERM environment, where people can pull the whistle, and people come not to shoot them, but actually come to figure out, how do we work together to solve the problem?
Mm-hmm. And that comes from the top.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that tone has to be set
at
the top, and it has to permeate through an organization. And in my mind, that's the best way to conduct oversight, is to get to it before you have to fix something, before there is a patient who's in danger, before there's a big fiasco that ends up on cable news somewhere. So in my mind, that communicating that willingness to hear these issues and giving people the confidence, if they need training on how to communicate, on what kinds of bells to ring or buttons to push to really get people's attention, that has to be a priority in my mind.
So one of the things that I think you're talking about a little bit is the role of people in this. And the task force looked at the topic through the lens of people, processes, and technology. So for people, we talked about it in terms of internal overseers and external overseers. Internal being your program managers and your agency leaders, the ones who would raise the issues before they get to the level of the external overseer, which is Congress, GAO. Janice, you work for the People Organization, or worked for the People Organization, so I'm going to throw this question back to you. Were there any examples of really strong internal oversight within OPM that you recall that you'd like to share with the group?
Well, one example was, and it was both internal and external, but the chairman did a great job of outlining what OPM does and how significant it is, and I couldn't support his views more thoroughly. But one of the things that we had to do that was critically important was oversight of the merit system, oversight of these principles that our democracy was founded on. And it was critical for me and very important for me to make sure we lived those merit principles, that we acted in a way as an agency that we could be an example. So I made sure that our director of personnel, who, you know, given these elaborate agency structures, was a few levels down from me. I made sure that he had access. I made sure that people checked in with him regularly, that I wanted him and his staff to know that they were empowered to let us know if something was awry, if there was a manager that perhaps, let me be diplomatic, perhaps needed more training, needed a little counseling on these things. I wanted to know from the very beginning. And we also adopted that approach when we were going into other agencies and working with them on their HR systems and their processes to make sure that the merit system was supported in an integral part of their hiring and retention process. We approached it as a coaching exercise. It would have been easy to do a bunch of got-yas. It would have been easy to come out with a list of things that weren't going well. We tried to do that, but we also tried to do it in a way that encouraged people to get it right, because it's so fundamentally important.
Wonderful.
What Janice doesn't mention during her tenure was the importance the administration gave to performance management of its people. She was a member of the cabinet, and that sent an important signal that recruiting and retaining the workforce the government needed to accomplish its mission was of the utmost importance. We haven't had that in many years. I think it's fair to say that we are unable to recruit and retain the workforce we need to accomplish the important missions of the government. And because it's not a priority, we haven't been able to invest in the structural, statutory, even financial changes necessary to fix it.
That's fair. So we talked a little bit about tone from the top and culture. Clarence, I know this is an important topic to you, and I believe one of the recommendations in the report was your doing on trust in the oversight culture. So is there anything else you wanted to add to that we didn't get to talk about already?
I think the thing I would speak to now would be the role of the senior executive. Some of the things that that you look at from where the Congress has overreacted, a problem with employees or whatever. If you go back to the root cause, sometimes we as senior executives have not done the right thing. There are a number of tough calls that have to be made. I think when you look at some of the challenges at GSA and Secret Service and others where there were examples of employee issues, if you go to the root cause, I've talked to some of the people there, the root cause, people knew about these issues long before and didn't do anything. So part of the rebalancing of compliance and performance is that I believe that the senior executives need to make tough calls when it's necessary. And I think they also need to deal with some of these personnel issues, because I think sometimes if you head these off, if you move aggressively to address these issues, you're going to then dissipate a lot of desires for new legislation and new policies and procedures, because we can manage this. We cannot issue policies and procedures to address this issue. This is an issue we have to address. And now ERM is a great one, and I think it will help tremendously, but there's still a role for the senior executive and the senior managers in the organization to make tough calls, to do what is necessary. And I think that instills confidence, and that buys you some level of freedom with the oversight, because they know that at the end of the day, you're going to try to do the right thing. So they'll give you a little bit more of a leash to operate than if they're concerned that you're not.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to bring the conversation back to the people, process, technology. We talked about the people, we talked about the process with ERM. What we haven't talked about is technology. As Connolly said, it's not a trivial matter. So Robert, I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the growing importance of technology and data in oversight and how that relates to some of your work also on evidence-based policymaking.
Yeah, Congressman warmed my heart by talking about the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, and I note that he was at BPC, which played a fundamental role in getting that law enacted. Now the challenge is to make sure that it's not a compliance exercise and that we meet the spirit of that act. as far as the data is concerned, government collects enormous troves of data. We ought to be able to leverage it to unlock some insights into what's working and what's not. And that law should help us get there. The guidance OMB issued last week is a first really important step in getting agencies to think about where their data sets in silos, what they need to do to integrate data sets to unlock those insights. But the technology, one of the things that we're seeing in the states is increasingly laws requiring, bless you, federal government contractors to employ technology that monitors every keystroke of their employees to be able to verify that they are actually working on the contracts for which they're billing. There's a balance here, I think. You can go way overboard in being too intrusive in leveraging technology for oversight purposes. The Fraud Analytics Act that GAO drove is a good example of where you can use simple technological data analytics techniques to ensure you're adequately monitoring instances of fraud. And the government is a fraud target-rich environment, and people need to think. Enterprise risk management is a great framework with which to think about these things. Where do you have those greatest risks? And how can we employ technology to better monitor whether or not we're being defrauded, whether the taxpayers are being defrauded?
That aspect that you were talking about too with the keystrokes gets to the trust, and I feel like there might be a delicate balance there that we could be on the verge of tipping.
There sure is. I'd be terrified if someone was monitoring my keystrokes.
As would I, and a lot of my supervisors are here.
We're oversharing, sorry.
Wanted to move on to the reputation that Oversight has of being a little compliance-focused and time-intensive. And to Connolly's point, one of our findings was that we might want to spend a little bit less time on compliance activities so that we have more time for really mission focus and mission performance. Clarence, you've worked in a number of agencies at a number of different levels. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you've made that trade-off between time spent on compliance versus performance?
One of the things that started doing, not exactly sure how, I would just go to the Inspector General and I would talk with them and tell them that as far as I'm concerned, you are a second set of eyes. You see anything, you're more than welcome to look all you would like. And then at times I would make referrals to them as well. And I think part of that, again, is that issue of trust. When they know that you are focused on performance and accountability, there's a different attitude. Didn't have, and this was across several different agencies, several different IGs, several different audit firms. But when you have that open flexibility, that willingness to talk and to be transparent, I found that it's a lot easier to manage. The same with the Congress, being open and transparent, knowing the roles and not stepping over the line, but that transparency, that communication, so that they understand what you're trying to do and why, has helped tremendously in the different roles that I've had.
That actually, sorry, Janice?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, my goal was always, let's get it right.
Yes.
The first time, or the second, maybe, or third, if that's what it takes. But let's not wait till we get into an oversight process or the accountability or, the end of the quarter or the end of the fiscal year where we look back and go, oh my gosh, what do we have to do to encourage people? Transparency is critical, Clarence. Open communication, a safe place, a safe way for employees to speak up and point out something that may not be going as well as it should. And that was always my goal. How do we get it right to start with? You know, the chairman talked about his scorecards that he receives. I mean, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have a bunch of reds that then we have to go back and undo and redo and get things, make things happen over and over again? Let's try to get it right the first time. And to me, a critical element of that is having a system, having a culture where people feel free to speak up and highlight or point out things that either could be better or that aren't going right.
So that actually leads me into the last question I had prepared before we move on to the questions, which is about one of our other recommendations, which is on the collaboration between oversight bodies and between internal oversight bodies and external oversight bodies. So the people within the agencies and external groups such as GAO. And so, Sally Ann, from your time working at GAO, do you have any examples or pointers you can share with us on ways that we could better build that collaboration moving forward?
I would reference Clarence's remarks because I think they're right on target. In any agency that I have been in, it's always been better to have forged a relationship with either GAO or the Inspector General, and I've ended up in front of oversight committees testifying sandwiched between them both. And having had the opportunity to forge those relationships has always been a good thing. From the oversight community side, though, there's a concept that you don't hear much of anymore, but that I've always appreciated, which is of constructive engagement, which is when the only time you don't see the Inspector General or the GAO audit team that's coming in is when they're doing an audit. When, if they have findings from other reports relevant to the tasks that you are doing in your agency, they bring those to bear. That type of engagement outside of a specific audit can be extremely valuable in forging relationships while allowing them to maintain their independence. Because under the audit rules, the generally accepted government auditing standards for purists, auditors have to maintain their independence. They can't have any conflicts of interest, and so that can constrain what they do. But there is nothing in terms of understanding and building program knowledge, which deepens their ability to do a good evaluation, and sharing past lessons learned from other types of engagements similar to the mission that you have, that would not help in terms of bringing better relationships and more effective programs, I think.
Thank you. Robert?
You know, I think the importance of collaboration across these oversight silos can't be overstated. I participated in a fascinating, sobering meeting Friday at the National Academy of Public Administration, the quarterly grants management symposium. We heard from an official with the Administration for Children and Families who had cataloged complaints of grantees about the extent to which oversight requirements, reporting requirements, compliance requirements distract from their accomplishing their mission. They receive funding from federal grant programs in silos when really they've got holistic challenges. And then we heard from the state of Virginia and Fairfax County, both of which are effectively overcoming these challenges, but having to do so through laborious efforts, very expensive, often technology solutions. Everybody in the room sort of agreed on the challenges and ways to overcome them. There was no one from the accountability community in the room. No, except for Ann Everts. There were no inspectors general. There were no auditors in the room. Those are the ones who really need to, we need to hold hands and jump over the cliff together if we're going to enter into this more risk-based approach. Congress is going to have to be involved. GAO is going to have to be involved. And that sounds terribly difficult to accomplish. So leadership focus on this will be essential for getting all those people in the room.
I am going to turn it over to the audience now for questions. I see one question right back here.
Hi, Regina. Hi, Virginia Hughes with GSA, formerly of OMB, some years ago. What you're saying about an excessive balance on compliance resonates with me, and I was thinking, in addition to detracting from the mission, it seems it has an unintended consequence on creating perhaps a risk-averse culture, and that can, permeate other areas. And I'm wondering if anyone would care to comment on that, and if you have ideas for ways to perhaps incent or appropriately reward appropriate risk-taking in the government.
I take that. You heard Chairman Connolly speak earlier about the reorganization proposal, and he's conducted oversight hearings. He talked about seeking information from the administration. That proposal and other reorganization proposals are, they're sort of risky for the administration to put out there. We're proposing things that are easy to criticize. We're often, responding to issues that others have identified, have talked about the same issues, but maybe haven't put forward proposals. And we talked about how the importance of trying to cooperate the oversight bodies between the branches. And despite those hearings, we've had numerous staff briefings, and yet to hear the description of the proposal from Chairman Connolly was somewhat disheartening from my perspective, not because he disagrees with it as far as he understands it, but that his understanding of it, as from what he expressed, didn't really comport with exactly what is being proposed. And so it is a constant struggle in that sense to maintain that dialogue, again, because the incentives do not necessarily align.
I would just add that Janice's description of how she tended to direct as a chief executive at OPM in terms of trying to create an environment where the messenger is not shot, but that information is able to flow up, and consistently reinforcing that is critical to having a trust built in that culture.
So it gets back to leadership.
Yes.
I mean, I think the quintessential example here is the GSA conference scandal. You've got some jackass's picture in a bathtub in Vegas with a champagne glass, which means nobody in the federal government can go to another conference.
Yes.
And it takes leadership to say, no, actually, if you read the guidelines that flowed from that scandal, they're all very reasonable. But a good leader can either overreact and put the kibosh on everything, or take a more reasonable approach under those constraints. It's hard in this environment, or any imaginable future environment, in which we won't have people taking political advantage of the extreme example of a violation of the trust Americans should have in us.
Mm-hmm. If I could use an example, I had a situation once where I got a call on a Friday afternoon from the White House. Yes, the building called me, but no, it was somebody in the White House, and they said, we're trying to prepare the president for this big speech, and we didn't know if you had any policy proposals that maybe were ready to go, that he could announce, that he could talk about. It was a gorgeous spring Friday in Washington. The cherry blossoms were blooming. There was not an SESer in the place. It was like around,
Poetic.
Yeah, it was around 4:20, and couldn't find an SESer. So, I start peeling back the layers, and it was basically who's in the building, right? Who's in the building? And this poor young woman came up, and I told her what we were looking for, and I said, you know, in your department, do you have anything that you're thinking about that you know, maybe, you know, if we sped it up a little bit, could be ready for this? How could we be responsive? And she said, I have an idea. I'm scared to tell you. I was like, well, she'd never been in my office. I knew her. You know, she was lovely. And I was like, well, you know, I promise. She goes, my bosses don't like it. And I just said, look, you know, help me out here. You know, it was kind of a tense moment. But it's sort of the inverse of, you know, what we've been talking about in the sense that I finally got it out of her. It was a brilliant idea. It is one that the president did announce and now has spread to the private sector all across the board. And it is that the federal government was the first major employer to allow employees to use sick leave to care for a family member instead of always using their annual leave. You know, I don't know if that would have happened without all of this, and it's not exactly oversight, but it goes to this culture of having people speak up and incentivizing them and rewarding them. I give her credit for this. All across the country, this has had a tremendous benefit for people, and it was all because this one young woman was there at work, you know, thank goodness. So, you know, she got a promotion, you know, I mean, she applied for a job. There was we applied the merit system, and, you know, she came through. So there are ways to create a culture where people who step forward, whether it's with a positive idea like that or something where they're saying, you know, things aren't going right, where you can in fact reward them. You know, that next Monday, I sat with her bosses. This is all fine. This is all good. You know, and we were able to work it out.
Thank you. One question over here.
I'll try to be brief, but I'm following up from what I asked Representative Connolly. When you're talking about risk management, the question I asked was about HUD and about the EB-5 program. And from what I know of both of them, I don't think there is any risk management, and the concept is block grants that the people, like cities or somebody, makes a request, and there is no oversight. And I agree there's many regulations and paperwork, but when I read about seminars to go to training for this, I start laughing because I'm like, they have to fill out all these forms, but no one ever says they're complying with it. And when I've asked HUD to do oversight, they, as far as I can tell, the only oversight of any substance, which is really not much, is Inspector General reports, as I say, 10 years after the fact, and then they'll say something like, well, don't do that again or something, and in the future, fill out the form better. And there's much fraud. I mean, there's criminal activity in both EB-5 and HUD, and I don't see the agencies doing any oversight at all, or risk management. I don't know what risk management even applies in their block grant program.
I would say that risk management, and particularly enterprise risk management, is variable across a large continuum. It is at an early stage of maturation in the federal space, so it does not exist everywhere. I would also say, if you honestly believe that there is fraud involved, use the GAO Watchdog Hotline and the IG Hotline. Other than that, I don't know that there's much that I could add to what Representative Conley had said.
What do the agency employees, what is their job? Like the HUD people overseeing block grant, what are they supposed to be doing?
I am not a block grant expert, so I'm probably not the right person to answer that question for you.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Steve Redburn. I wonder if the goal is to change the culture of oversight and compliance in the executive branch, whether you need to think about changing the professional orientations and backgrounds and education or curricula of the people who are typically hired into IG's offices and other compliance oversight responsibility offices within the executive branch. Have you given some thought to how you would broaden the professional perspectives of the people who typically come into those jobs, who often have a background in accounting or law enforcement in some cases? That's my question.
I think cybersecurity is an area that it's acknowledged that obviously there's tremendous and growing risks in cybersecurity in the federal government, and that IGs obviously do look at that area. And I know, I mean, I've talked to several of them about how they feel like they are not, and this is an area, of course, where across the federal government, despite a lot of different efforts going on in this administration, we struggle to hire folks with cybersecurity expertise. But that's an area in particular where, like you said, outside of the typical sort of accounting sort of auditors that IGs have, I think that's where they really need more personnel.
Steve, for the IG audit shops that I'm familiar with, they have their criminal investigative side, and that does require certain credentialing in order to go with that series. They have their financial audit side, or they contract it out and oversee that audit, so you would hope that they would have some accounting expertise. The IGs, largely, the rest of their work is entirely discretionary. They can pick and choose what they look at. So from my perspective, I would recommend the GAO model, which is they are looking for strong, analytical generalists that have the capacity to adopt to new analytical techniques, new technologies, those types of things, but bring more of a logical flow to their thought processes than any particular other background, accounting or law enforcement. And that would be a model we didn't look at as part of the task force, but that I would strongly recommend.
But if you're trying to change the culture, this is the perfect avenue through which to do it, because this community has to be a strong partner if you're going to adopt a more risk-based culture. The IG community is not monolithic by any stretch of the imagination, but there's an organizational body that meets, SIGI, that I think could be used to drive more of this.
We are out of time, but I wanted to thank our panelists again for joining us and thank the audience for your participation. Now I'm going to turn it over to Michael Thorning and the second panel.
Okay, thanks everyone for bearing with us through our little mic change here. My name is Michael Thorning. I'm the Associate Director of our Congress Project here at BPC, and I've been working with our oversight task forces over the last 2 years, first with our Oversight and Inspectors General Task Force, and now I have the honor of being joined by some of our panelists are from our task force we've been talking about here today, and we also have one special guest, and so I'll just go ahead and get started and introduce our panelists. Right next to me, Linda Springer. Linda served as a senior advisor at the Office of Management and Budget for the first 5 months of the current administration. She was also a part of the Trump transition. She led the management component for OMB. Prior to that, she served as the 8th director of the Office of Personnel Management, and she also has served as controller and head of the Office of Federal Financial Management at OMB. Thanks for being here, Linda. Denise Wilson. Denise has led a 30-year career in government, both in the legislative branch and the executive branch. She served 27 years on Capitol Hill, notably for many years on the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee as a senior professional staff member, and then beginning in 2009 as a special assistant to President Obama in the White House Office of Legislative Affairs, and she also was on our Oversight and Inspectors General Task Force last year. Dave Mader. Dave is the Chief Strategy Officer for the civilian sector for Deloitte's federal government practice. Dave, prior to that, served as controller at the Office of Management and Budget from 2014 to 2017. He's also held numerous senior executive positions at the Internal Revenue Service, from working there from 1971 to 2003, including as acting deputy commissioner, and he's held numerous other positions in the government and in the private sector. Thanks for being here, Dave. And then Ann Everts. Ann, although not a member of our task force, we've asked her here today for her extensive expertise in oversight and accountability in government. Ann is the CEO of the Association of Government Accountants and has more than 30 years of experience in management consulting with the federal government. She spent 26 years at Booz Allen Hamilton as a vice president in the financial services group. And there she focused on providing management and technical services support to numerous federal agencies. So we have an excellent panel here with lots of knowledge, and I'll just jump right into some questions with them. I'll have specific questions for each of you, but I thought I might just start out with something a little more general. You know, and I think we've already gotten a sense of this here today. When the public outside of Washington and some within the Beltway hear oversight, they think about waste, fraud, and abuse, wrongdoing, mismanagement, congressional hearings, tense political point scoring. Can oversight be more than that? And can it be more than finger pointing and actually help to improve how government works and the results that the American people get?
Well, I'll start with that. And I think throughout the morning we've heard some elements of this, but to tie it together, I think a lot of it is the result of advanced relationships that already exist. And to the extent that there's good communication, there's a commonality of at least how to operate with each other, and to understand that there's a lot that we agree on more than disagree, and that we're looking to a common purpose. And doing that in advance so there aren't surprises, that you eliminate the gotcha perspective, and I think the chairman mentioned that in his remarks, that a lot of that will go away. And so whether it's in a hearing or whether it's in a relationship, a conference with an auditor, GAO, or even within agencies themselves, any of the oversight relationships that we mentioned in the report, I think can be much more fruitful and much more productive if there's an advanced relationship, and that is dependent on both parties, I think, developing that relationship, working it continuously in advance, and then I think you'll find more productivity coming from it.
I'm kind of jumping on the same bandwagon as my colleague and also the panel
previous. And I think I'd like to acknowledge Clarence and also align myself with Janice's comments as well. It's trust in the oversight culture that is really, really important. And I think agencies would do well to have good lines of communication with their internal and external oversight colleagues. And I think that is extremely important. And I think to the extent you're able to do that from the very beginning, hopefully you're in a position to mitigate and actually see that changes can be made for the betterment of the program or the agency.
I mean, I think, Michael, continuing back in my IRS career, I had responsibility for a number of years for congressional relationships. And I remember probably the first week that I was on the job with that responsibility, I went up to meet with the staff director for the House Ways and Means Subcommittee on IRS Oversight. And I remember her saying, look, Dave, if we want to have a constructive relationship, there are two things that you need to keep in mind. And if you keep these in mind and adhere to them, we're going to have a good relationship. That is no surprises and no lies. And you know, during all of my years at the IRS, you know, IRS was not always the most favorite agency in any administration and in any Congress, right? But I think keeping that open relationship with the Congress, with the IGs, with the GAO is important. Fast forward to my experience in the Obama administration, there was real property reform legislation that was working in the House of Representatives. And there was a series of a couple of hearings that I testified at. And actually, it, you know, in spite of sort of the tension that existed back then in that administration between the House and the White House, we saw a value in what the House of Representatives was proposing to do. They, you know, allowed us during these hearings to put forward our position, and then we had subsequent dialogue at the staff level to work through some of the issues that we didn't think maybe quite hit the point, that we thought maybe administratively implementing them would be difficult. But we wound up with a piece of legislation that the House passed, the Senate passed, and probably in December, just before he left office, President Obama signed. So the process can work if you commit the time and the effort to it.
And anything to add?
Sure, I'd like to add in, Sally Ann mentioned ERM, and I think ERM has gone a long way to bringing together and, you know, in reinforcing and encouraging communication across the organization. We recently, AJA and one of our corporate partners recently completed an IG survey, and you know, one of the things we talked about and we focused on was transparency and accountability. And you know, the SIGI community that was mentioned earlier launched 2 years ago Oversight.gov, which put out all the reports, made them all, you know, available to the public in one site, so you wouldn't have to dig through every agency's individual site. And it really lets you, you know, look across the board at where some of the challenges are, but also where, you know, if you can't solve a problem if you don't know about it. And I think the recommendations that come out of these oversight communities are beneficial. It's not that I gotcha. Nobody's trying to give everybody a black eye. It's just how can we improve and how do we, you know, spend rare dollars more effectively. So whether it's the audit community that's identifying challenges in internal controls, the IG community finds value in those audits. They identify some areas where they can then do a deeper dive in a program review or doing a performance review. So they are beneficial. If you look at the SIGI website on Oversight.gov, it tells you how many billions of dollars have been saved. Some of them recovered through investigations. So those are positive attributes and positive outcomes from the oversight community.
Can I build a little bit on, because we've talked in the report and the panels about ERM, and I was at, as Sally Ann mentioned, at OMB when we decided, you know, let's sort of look at a framework and expand on what's already been existing in the CFO community for years. And when you think about, you know, internal controls, and you go back to the history of internal controls, it really was meant to apply to all programs, not just federal financial management. It just seems like, you know, over, you know, since the CFO Act, it got a lot of traction in the CFO community, but internal controls exist everywhere, whether they're in IT or programmatically. And somebody mentioned earlier that when I came to OMB, this was coming off of the disaster of, healthcare.gov, which, was a major sort of cornerstone to ensuring the implementation of the Affordable Health Care Act. And I also had some personal experiences, and Clarence will remember this from his IRS days, where we had a major debacle in the mid-1980s around filing season. And I started to think about, is there an approach that the executive branch can take that actually would allow program managers and executives at both political as well as career level understand what the risks are in delivering their programs each and every day. And I think about ERM basically as an offensive tool and also as a defensive tool. When I think about offense, I want to know, as the head of the agency, as the head of the program, what is it really going to take to implement these programs? What are the resources? What is the technology? What's the legislation? What are the regulations that I need to put in place? And I build a plan. And on a defensive note, when inevitably my IG or GAO or the Congress is going to oversight the effectiveness of that, I actually have a very disciplined, documented approach to say, here's all the things that I considered. Here's the risks that I identified. Here's the actions that I took to mitigate those risks. So to me, it was a matter of, can we ensure better discipline in implementation and outcomes? And can we actually, as an executive branch, sort of protect ourselves from the inevitable amount of oversight and criticism about how we've implemented a particular program?
Linda, I might come back to you. Early in this administration, you led efforts to streamline some federal government. Can you talk a little bit about why that was important and what was the goal there?
Well, we started with the assumption that it was very easy for those types of requirements to emerge and to be added to the inventory of compliance requirements that agencies had. What we believed also was that it was less likely that they would be removed. And so the notion was that we would do a review to see what had become obsolete, what was redundant, what was overtaken by new circumstances, to see if we could, we used the term clean the closet. So if you think of clothes that you had that maybe were in style 20 years ago, and they fit at that time, and not only are they out of style today, but they don't fit. And by the way, I mentioned this to the Comptroller General, Gene Dodaro, at one point, and he said, yeah, but styles come back. And I said, yeah, but they won't fit anymore. So, but the point was that, and that's kind of a way of saying that we hadn't looked in the closet in some time. But theoretically, people were still, and agencies were still required to comply. They had never been, deactivated or removed or sunsetted. And in fact, that was one of the things that we were considering, was that any new requirement, or at least in many cases, there should be a consideration of a sunset. And then if it made sense, it could be kind of revitalized or re-engaged to continue for another period of time. But this notion of open-ended requirements that really had outlived their usefulness, but we're still taking a certain amount of time. Now, we tried to find out, and in the report, I think we make a recommendation of having agencies actually develop some metrics and some data around how much time it's actually taking. Anecdotally, we knew that it was taking a lot of time, but when we tried to find out at the Department of Defense, how much time are you spending complying with this particular OMB requirement or this OPM requirement, sometimes we had hard numbers, but sometimes the data wasn't there. So I think in our study, we thought it would be helpful to have that information to support a more rationalized set of requirements. And we also felt that central management agencies, central oversight agencies, beginning at OMB, but then GSA, OPM, and then others to a lesser degree, should be looked at as well, and I think that has continued to some degree. And what we also found was that there wasn't resistance within OMB in this case to doing that review. You might think that they were going to hold on to those requirements. 20 years ago, we put this requirement in place, and, by goodness, we are not going to let go of this one. The reality was quite the opposite. They actually did want to get rid of those things and instead have people spend their time on things that were more worthwhile, more contemporary, more suited to the issues that they were trying to deal with today. So that was the theory behind it. And there have been several tranches of those. Now, to actually remove a requirement, even if it doesn't make sense anymore, we've even learned from Congress when they attempted to do it. Some years back, there were hundreds that were identified. And ultimately, I think there were a few dozen that actually were removed. So this, when you talk about oversight and removing obsolete requirements, this applies to both branches of government equally.
Denise, you've seen oversight from both sides of it. You've been in the executive branch, you've been in the legislative branch, and I think that's given you some insight into something that we've talked a lot about here today, is that there is a human aspect, an individual aspect to the oversight culture in government. What are some things that federal leaders can do to improve that culture and incentivize the people who report to them and who are, line managers on programs? How do you incentivize them to focus more on performance and outcomes?
Well, that picks up on a lot. I think what's really important, and again, I'm going back to Janice and my colleagues on the previous panel, it starts from the top. It's really important for the person who is running the agency to make sure that they go after bad behavior, make sure that they are looking out at, for instance, the reports that come out from the IG and also from the GAO in terms of their recommendations. I think that's really important and a good place to start. But I think constructive engagement and also working collaboratively within the organization and also with the internal and external operations. I just think that's really, really important. And I think we come back to the trust. It is important to have trust, whether it's oversight in Congress, whether it's oversight within the federal agencies. There has to be a high level of that in addition to integrity. And I think those are critical components of that.
I ask a quick follow-up to draw a little bit on your experience on Capitol Hill.
Okay.
I got a little bit of a sense from Congressman Connolly that there's going to be some sense on Capitol Hill or maybe sensitivity toward a little bit of what the report is talking about, this rebalancing of compliance and performance, which the task force found is very heavily weighted toward compliance and not enough toward performance. What needs to be done to kind of get Capitol Hill on board and help them realize the importance of that rebalancing?
Well, I think Chairman Connolly gave his view in terms of how compliance is necessary and it is important, and I think Congress certainly looks at a lot of it from that angle. And in terms of making a swap, I don't know that that's really going to happen. I think Congress is very wedded to the idea of making sure that there is compliance. I think they are interested in the performance aspect of it, but I think at the end of the day, and again, I kind of align myself with Chairman Connolly's comments, compliance is critical. It is critical and it is important. And it's going to be, I don't see that being taken out of that process.
Sure. Dave, I might, a little bit, and to lead into this, it sounds a little bit, the executive branch certainly then, if that's the case, is really going to have to take up the mantle on the performance focus. And you had a hand, as been talked about a couple of times here, in really updating OMB's Circular A123 and integrating enterprise risk management into that. What are some of the tools within that guidance that can help departments and agencies better balance risk and deliver results?
I want to sort of build on some of the comments that Sally had in the last panel, in that this has been, it's 3 years this month that we actually rolled out the requirement. in A123. And there's been, I think, a generally positive reaction on the part of the CFO Act agencies. The application varies across the different departments. There have been departments that have had risk programs, robust risk programs, for years and years, long before OMB required it. Others are sort of at the early stages of identifying, how do I apply this? How do I acquire the right skill set within individuals in order to implement this? So I think, Michael, this is a longer-term learning. It's going to take, I think, a couple of years. And I think to Janice's point, and to a couple of the other comments about trust, what I'm hoping is that as organizations embrace risk, and it's actually embraced at the highest levels, and we know there's interactions between cabinet secretaries and people who are responsible for these risk programs in different departments. I think if you build that trust at the highest level, both political and career, then as you sort of move down in the organization, people are going to be more inclined to basically raise their hand and say, I've got a problem. And, you know, Clarence touched on that in his comments. And, you know, my years at the IRS, one of the biggest problems we had, and what resulted in this, you know, filing season debacle in 1985, was people actually knew that this system was not going to work, and people did not raise their hand and raise these issues to upper leadership. And why not? Because I didn't want to be viewed as somebody that was a naysayer, or maybe, you know, it's going to attack my competence as the manager of this program. The result of that, not doing that, was basically we barely had a filing season operational in 1985. So again, I think it's a matter of years of building this through the department, starting at the very top, and continually sort of drive the importance of it's okay to identify problems.
You know, are there still some further changes maybe you could see in A123 or other guidance that would help departments and agencies kind of make this rebalancing a reality?
You know, one of the things we didn't do, and I still don't know what the right answer is, we did not in the requirement in A123 mandate the establishment of a chief risk officer. We left it up to each of the cabinet level departments to decide how they were actually going to implement the program. And the rationale at the time was we want to actually have risk as part of how I manage my program day in and day out. So what we didn't want to do is impose another position or a change to how a cabinet secretary was managing his or her department. We wanted them to make it sort of part of the fabric of how they operate. We have some that have chief risk officers. We have others that are, I think, probably located too low in an organization. So I'm still not sure what the right answer is on whether this should be elevated. But again, to Clarence's point, you know, how many chiefs do we need reporting to, you know, a deputy secretary day in and day out?
You know, from the accountability community's perspective, what kinds of resources and planning would need to be, you know, implemented to make this sort of transformation happen that we're talking about here? And, you know, are the federal government and the accountability community ready right now to take on this sort of rebalancing of compliance and performance?
Well, a couple things. One of the points I know that we had talked about is talking about how do you enhance mission outcomes. You look at compliance requirements. The financial audit is a requirement. And there are many cabinet level agencies that are getting unmodified opinions year over year. So doing things well. Could they do things better? Sure, because every audit will have, you know, where you're compliant, and then areas that can withstand some improvement. Same thing with, you know, the IG audits on performance or programs. You know, they're not just looking to give you a black eye. It's to identify, again, what's working well, continue to do that or do more of it, and then identify areas that you need to work on. One of the things we were talking about is, you know, recommendations from the IG should be dealt with and are usually accepted. When we look at the agency financial reports that came out, the AFRs, annual requirement, due to OMB the 15th, actually this year, 19th of November, and my organization does a review for excellence and accountability reporting, for looking for those that are not just compliant, but those that are going the extra step. And what we look for is the coordination between the IG community, agency leadership, looking at risk and what that balance is, because that report tells the story of an agency. And there aren't really other reports that do that pull together what the organization's supposed to be doing and then how they're doing it, looking at year-over-year measures and performance. Now, does all the performance information come in when it's needed for those reports? No, but more information, is provided and does balance out and float up. I think one of the things in looking at what the IGs do, and when we just finished a survey, and 75% of them say if you didn't do that financial audit, they believe internal controls would suffer. So part of that compliance or requirement continues to keep people on their toes and keeps, focus on those internal control areas. But the IG community is looking, I think they would rather do more program and performance audits than just focusing on the compliance, check the box, the ones they have to do every year. We were talking earlier about how long audits take, and so I knew I wouldn't remember my numbers, so I brought them. So compliance audits, 53% of them take 7 to 12 months. That's a long time. But performance audits still take a lot of, 50% of them take 7 to 12 months, 40% 13 to 18 months. So some of it's access to information, pulling the data together. Some of them need, we talk about how do you enhance their ability to do work faster, better, smarter. Technology, that was brought up at the last panel. Tools, the training of their staff, so they can leverage those tools faster. There's a lot of benefit that comes from those audits. The DoD audit, which, when you think about it, the first time for FY18, biggest audit in the world, right? Most complex. There are lots of charts that identify and compare, with the DoD to Amazon and Walmart and the number of employees and the amount of assets and how much money. And when you talk with folks in DoD, they had 2,300 findings. To most of us, we would be swamped saying, okay, how do I dig out of that? And what do we do next? But the benefits that accrued from those audit or from that audit were incredibly fortunate for the Department of Defense. One, they found equipment that they didn't know they had, so they now didn't have to buy it. They just had to move it to where they needed it to install it. So part of it was, you think, well, that's a basic thing. Right. But without the rigor and the discipline of the audit process, they might not have found some of the issues that now they can correct. So there are tremendous benefits, I think, from the oversight, the audits. Some may not sound so sexy, but they are beneficial to the organization.
And I think that, in that regard, Congress is going to be always circling around that because that is important and there are benefits to be derived from that. And so I don't see how they move away from it.
So can I add to that? So I think Congress would benefit, but that was a bit of a depressing, to me, finding in our survey. So again, 13% of agencies meet weekly with their congressional counterparts, 17% monthly, 17% quarterly. And then we have 34% meet once a year, annually, 34%. And 17% of the folks that we interviewed have never met with their congressional oversight bodies. So how do you take the benefit, the learning, the great information that they're finding out in the agencies and get those up to the congressional bodies? Because when we have budget crises every year, couldn't we be using our money better, and Congress could be more informed when they're setting budget priorities if they knew all the challenges that were being felt at the agencies and where the money could be focused to get the bang for the buck.
Yeah. I know that, and Denise will appreciate this. That was one of the major findings in our IG report last year. It was about the really surprising lack of regular meetings between those two ends of things. So,
and just to add to that, is that creates an adversarial type of culture or mood around those relationships. Because it gives the appearance that you're trying to hide or avoid. I don't want to meet with you. Why? Well, I don't want you to know something. Or as opposed to, and that may not even be the case, but it creates a hurdle right from the very beginning that is going to get in the way and really start the ball rolling in the wrong direction.
Or when the only times that you do meet with them is when there's a problem.
Right.
There's a
that is not the way to go.
Yeah.
That is not how you want to introduce yourself.
Right.
The supposition is that you would meet with them if there weren't a problem.
Right. I think, though, Michael, going back to something that that Congressman Connolly said, I wonder whether people really understand about this co-equal, right? I mean, I think sometimes in the executive branch, and I'm thinking more around career people thinking, well, if a committee doesn't agree with me, then, there's going to be a problem. It's okay to disagree. It's okay to disagree. I've had lots of different views on how to solve a problem with committee staff and with members in hearings, where it's like, in a lot of these issues, there's more than one way to resolve an issue. They have a view, I have a view. It doesn't make them right or wrong, right? But I think sometimes in the executive branch, there's this fear of, well, if I go up there and they have a different point of view, that's going to put me at a disadvantage, or I have to agree with them. No, you don't have to agree with them. If you have the rationale as to why you're sort of moving in a certain direction, then express those views. I don't know.
You don't have to agree, but you need to be able to explain your position.
Right.
Because it's a give and take process, and it's important. No, everybody should not be in full agreement, and everybody isn't going to be. But you have to stand your ground. Say what you mean and mean what you say, and be able to explain it.
So one point, I mean, when we talked to the IGs, they weren't resisting going to the Hill. They weren't invited. So I don't mean to say, when I say they didn't speak with them, that they were asked and they said no way. I'm saying that they weren't asked. They weren't invited back up.
An issue that came out when we were discussing the IG report was that IGs need to take the initiative. Their staff needs to take the initiative.
To be proactive.
And be on the Hill and be proactive. That is, I keep coming. It's being proactive. It's leadership. It's trust in the oversight culture. That is what defines the people, the process, and technology.
Right. I think we identified a great best practice in that of, there were some committees who were, like you said, meeting, regularly and talking about both what is for instance, IG's priority in terms of oversight at the agency or department, and then, hearing from the committee about what were they planning to do in terms of oversight, and how can those, be more collaborative. So. I think I'll ask one more question, then we'll open it up to the audience here. But I had originally thought of this mostly for you, Linda, because you were involved, obviously, with the most recent transition, and then at the early stages in this administration. I think in trying to get the government to where we're talking about it needs to go. But certainly everyone here has, probably something they could add to this. But what does this administration or a future administration need to focus on, and maybe focus on as a top priority, and then some other ones, but to get us from a place where we have an imbalance with compliance and performance to more balance between those?
Well, there are many ways to answer that question. But if I were to pick just two, I think it's first continuing the efforts, and this was as much career as it was political, to see through this review and make it part of the regular routine to just not let that closet build back up with requirements that ultimately become meaningless and obsolete. And I think if that continues and becomes a way of doing things and spreads across the agencies, not just at the central management oversight agencies, but beyond, and work with the councils and work with others to have it be a two-way thing that says, we've been doing this for 20 years, but really it's meaningless to us. So I think that's one, continuing to do that. And then the second is, I think I don't know how this would work, but somehow to start to take that initiative to reach out with the various oversight entities, pick up the phone, set up the meeting, set up a call, say, I would like to talk with you. I would like to hear what's on your mind. I'd like you to hear what we're thinking about. Let's see if we could find some commonality, inform each other, and sort of cast aside some of this adversarial relationship. And if they could take the initiative, that would be my advice to the administration, is across the agencies, not just your leg affairs person going up, but find the people that are program managers and others, and not waste people's time, but I think take some steps proactively to have those relationships with various oversight entities. I think it would go a long way.
Any other thoughts?
I agree with Linda.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we're ready for audience questions. I think we have a couple of people with microphones around the room, and if you could just, two things is just identify yourself and please ask a question when you ask a question.
Hi, my name is Jack Kelly. I guess I'm going to direct my question to both Linda and Dave. One of the things that Clarence talked about was the kind of silos that we have in government. And when you think about policy that comes out of OMB, I'm wondering if you two are optimistic that OMB might end up doing a better job at issuing guidance that doesn't reinforce those silos, but rather cuts across. And I can give you an example. I was thrilled to see the ERM, A123 be revised to take an enterprise risk management approach. However, none of that risk management language found its way into the asset management guidance, for example. And so wouldn't it be nice if OMB structured, and let me rephrase, do you think it's likely that OMB might ever restructure its guidance so that agencies are asked to tell OMB and the Congress how much this funding level is going to contribute to expected performance, and what are the risks involved at carrying out reaching those performance goals at that funding level?
I mean, my experience in the time that I was at OMB is, besides ERM, I think there were, Jack, a couple of initiatives that we tried to sort of look across the CXO community and say, it deals, like cyber in particular, really touched on human capital, it touched on financial, touched on controls, and obviously touched on IT. So I think people understand they try to do that. I'm not sure we get it right 100% of the time. Although your comment, though, on, the cost, right, the cost and burden, I guess, especially where it's mandated by legislation, Congress says you're going to go do something. We had that opportunity during, if you're engaged during legislation, you have that opportunity to actually make those points. And we certainly did that before I got to OMB when the Data Act was being, worked in Congress. There were a lot of conversations about, this was a huge unfunded mandate. The Congress basically said, thanks for the input, here's the bill. Right. But, we persisted and actually in the following 2-3 years actually did get some funding for that. Making the agencies go calculate what that unfunded mandate is goes back to, I think, something that Linda said. To me, that's an interesting set of data that nobody cares about, and it's just going to cost more money to go gather.
Yeah, I would agree with what Dave said, and I think another piece to this, Jack, that helps tie things together across what are now silos is the evidence-based approach, because if you think about it, it's evidence for anything, whether it's personnel or finance or IT or anything else, any other type of program. And so I think that when you look at things through that lens, that will be another tool that OMB, and I haven't read the new guidance yet, but OMB and the agencies themselves can use to pull together different disciplines and have a more unified approach.
Okay. Right here.
Hi, I'm Courtney. I'm a reporter for GovExec. I was wondering if you could talk about how government oversight happens and during a transition as we're heading into an election year and there's a potential new president, how that all functions.
Linda, you might be in a position to talk about it at least from
yeah, maybe not. I mean, I think I was never in a government position for that period between an election and the inauguration, particularly when there's a changeover. So, but I think that doesn't mean that oversight should stop. I think it's different. I think that you're looking more toward things that will have lasting value regardless of the incoming administration's priorities. So I think and I think it takes on the role, or it can, in the best case, it'll take on the role of helping to inform them, the incoming team, of things that maybe haven't been revealed or revealed in the fullest sense during the transition or a campaign. So I think that there's a little bit of a change, maybe either an emphasis or the subject of the oversight, but I think it's just as important, and in some ways it adds particular value during a transition, particularly when it's a change, which I think is what you're implying, of administration.
Dave, did you have any experience that maybe?
Yeah, I mean, in my not so much
yeah.
at OMB, but during my IRS days, I was here in Washington from the transition of Senior Bush to Clinton to George W., then to the Obama administration. You know, with regard to, and Sally Ann certainly is the expert on this, I mean, GAO continues to do their job as required by the Congress. IGs continue to do their independent oversight. So I never saw a lapse, although I think Linda made a good point, is that when a new administration comes in, certainly there is a huge reservoir of information, positive information around how programs are performing, that new administration would really benefit from looking at and saying, okay, you know, this program looks like this, I want to continue it, but it's got these problems and I want to emphasize these particular points. So I see oversight during transition as very, very positive to an incoming administration or to the second term of an administration.
Yeah. One thing I'd add to that, I do recall very early in the Trump administration, the chairman of the SIGI, who was Michael Horowitz, the DOJ IG, came into the OMB director almost immediately with a list of, I don't know if it was maybe 50 recommendations, but it was a very long list of findings and recommendations that he was hoping to share face-to-face, which happened. And the idea was that would help inform some of OMB's work by virtue of the oversight that had been done previously by the IG community. So I think that would be a specific example.
I was on the transition team, and we went in. I went in with agency review teams to talk to the agencies about what works, what doesn't work, what's good, what isn't good, what needs to be looked at in greater detail. So, but it was pretty cut and dried.
Like time for one last question right here.
Virginia Hughes, GSA. Back to the idea of compliance, the balance, and mission. Has any thought been given to the idea of sort of calculating evaluating the concept of diminishing returns when you're pursuing a compliance activity? I think everyone understands if you're just going to spend a couple $100,000 to pursue $10,000, it's not worth it. We could use data analytics. Has there been any thought given to pursuing what some of those activities could be to make some real benefits to the government?
Yeah, I actually think there's been a lot of conversation. Ann touched on it with regard to the financial audit, but Robert Shea touched on it in his comment around improper payment, something that I've been involved in for years and years. And, there's a really, really heavy compliance burden that's put on every single agency on programs above a certain threshold. And when you look at some of these programs, these agencies are working diligently to reduce the improper payment, but year over year, you're not going to actually see any change. And yet they have to spend the same amount of resources. Not only do they spend the same amount of resources doing the sample, doing the calculations, then the IG is also spending resources. I think on the financial audit, one of the things that when I was at OMB, Mark Rieger, who's the deputy controller, and I kicked around actually with GAO was there are some organizations that have now a track record of probably a dozen or more years of clean audits, right, with minimal material weaknesses or any kinds of, right?
20 years.
20 years.
Yeah.
You got to ask yourself, could we do an audit every 2 years or 3 years? I don't know. We spend a lot of money across the federal government on financial audits, and do you need to do that when, to your point, Virginia, somebody is actually demonstrating, consistent performance around complying with rules and regulations?
You did mention the use of technology, and I'm really happy to be in a position where supporting the CFO Council and that community, as well as the SIGI, we are doing a joint event August 5th to look at how emerging technologies are impacting the profession. How do you upskill? How do you leverage the best practices across all those organizations? You have 72, 73 IGs, 24 CFO Act agencies. How do we collectively get the best practices and the ways to leverage not only the technology, but people that have, experimented and now have proven that some of their approaches work, whether it's looking at fraud, waste, and abuse, looking at outliers, analytics, data visualization, all sorts of tools that, if they're leveraged appropriately with skilled, users, I think we could save money. You could do things more effectively and efficiently and maybe target than the approach on an audit.
Great. Okay, well, that's all the time we have for this panel, so if you join me in thanking them. I'm going to ask you all to stay up here just for a moment while Dan Blair is going to wrap up for us. And I want to thank, on behalf of BPC, Dan for all of his diligent work in bringing this group of experts together and guiding the group and really leading this effort to get us where we are today. So thank you, Dan. If you want to come up and wrap us up briefly.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for your diligence in staying through this program this morning. It's been a real pleasure to be able to lead this project, and working with Michael and Becky and Brenna and John and the whole BPC staff to put this together has really been a labor of love, and I really appreciated the opportunity. I think we have some key takeaways from the event this morning, and I really appreciate Congressman Connolly's pushback on the report, because if we were all singing Kumbaya and thought everything was wonderful and perfect, then I don't think we were doing our jobs. I understand that when you talk to Congress, and I talk to the big Congress, raising the issue of oversight and compliance and anything that might even suggest that there should be less of this, really strikes a chord. And that's not what our report is saying. But I think our report is saying we can do it differently and in a better way. And this is really part of the evolution of the whole good government and better management practices that's been going on since the early 1990s with the enactment of the CFO Act and then later with GIPRA and the whole line of management legislation. I think we've seen that oversight is more than just checking off a box. Compliance is more than just checking off a box. Compliance didn't prevent the OPM breach. It didn't prevent the Snowden breach of information. It didn't prevent the Chelsea Manning leak at the Pentagon. It didn't prevent the GSA scandals. And so we see that compliance really needs to be updated more for a 21st century or mid-21st century perspective. And I would suggest that compliance can be divided up into the process like FSMA. And FSMA is important, but did it do what it was supposed to do? And the idea that compliance really now needs a risk-based component to it, in which we focus on performance and mission accomplishment. The most effective oversight would give federal managers and supervisors the ability to fix things before they happen. And that was what we talked about in our IG report last year, that, for all the reports that the IGs do, it'd be wonderful if they could have prevented the problem rather than addressed the problem after the fact. We've talked about the importance of leadership as well, and trust in the oversight culture. That doesn't mean a blank check, but it does mean we need to institutionalize these practices. And you raised the question with regards to the transition, that if you institutionalize these things, they occur naturally, and that we can improve government performance and effectiveness, and especially empowering the career managers and executives. With that, thank you all for coming this morning. I hope that you had some good things to take back with you following this, and I hope that you all have a wonderful day and a wonderful summer. So thank you. Bye-bye.